Every country on Earth is currently in debt. The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. The entire planet owes $315 trillion, a number that is 3 times larger than the entire global economy. But here is the mathematical paradox that should terrify you. If every single nation owes money, who exactly are we paying? The answer isn't what you think. Because when you follow the chain of creditors, when you track who actually holds the paper, you discover something disturbing. The world doesn't owe money to someone else. It owes money to itself. But this isn't an accident. 4 specific men, across 3 different centuries, designed it this way deliberately. They built a system where debt can never be repaid, where governments must borrow forever, and where the interest flows eternally upward to the people who designed the trap. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The meetings happened, the contracts exist, and the mechanisms are public record. Once you see how these 4 architects built the machine, you will understand why the $38 trillion debt isn't a problem to be solved. It is the system working exactly as designed. Let me show you the 4 moments when the trap was engineered, starting with the man who decided debt should last forever. To understand why your government never actually pays off its debt, we have to go back to a time when debt was actually temporary. Before 1694, if a king wanted to wage war, he had to borrow money the old-fashioned way, by asking wealthy merchants or nobles for a loan. It was a personal transaction. If the king won the war, he paid the money back. If he lost, or if the treasury ran dry, he would simply default. It was messy, it was risky for the lenders, and crucially, the debt had an end date. It was either repaid or it was wiped out. But in 1691, a Scottish merchant named William Patterson changed the course of history with an idea that would enslave the future to the present. England was desperate. King William III was fighting a costly war against France. The treasury was empty, and traditional lenders were refusing to give him another dime because England had a history of stiffing its creditors. Patterson approached the king with a proposal that sounded like madness, but was actually a stroke of dark genius. Patterson offered to organize a group of wealthy merchants to lend the government £1.2 million, a massive sum at the time. But here was the innovation that rewired the world. The loan would never be repaid. The government would not have to return a single ounce of gold to the lenders. Instead, the king would agree to pay interest on that money forever. Patterson proposed creating a new institution called the Bank of England to manage this scheme. The merchants would deposit their gold into the bank. The bank would lend it to the government, and the government would use its power of taxation to pay 8% interest annually, in perpetuity. For the merchants, it was the ultimate safe investment. They had essentially bought an annuity backed by the violence of the state. As long as England existed and could tax its peasants, the merchants would get their check. But Patterson's scheme went one layer deeper, and this is the part that birthed the modern financial trap. The Bank of England was given the legal right to issue paper banknotes up to the value of the loan. They could print paper money that was backed by the government's debt. This was the moment where debt became money. The government's IOU became the currency of the realm. Suddenly, the more the government borrowed, the more money could be created. This created a perverse incentive structure where the government had no reason to ever be debt-free. If they paid back the loan, the money supply would shrink. So, for the first time in human history, debt became a permanent feature of the system rather than a temporary problem to be solved. Parliament approved the charter in 1694, and the trap was set. Patterson died without a fortune, but the system he built is still running 331 years later. The British government's debt has been rolled over, refinanced, and expanded, but never extinguished. But while Patterson created the engine of permanent debt, it took another man, a century later, to turn that engine into a global weapon that could control the fate of nations. While Patterson created the concept of permanent debt, it was a man named Nathan Rothschild who industrialized it, turning debt into a weapon of global control. By the early 1800s, the Rothschild family had done something unprecedented. They established banking houses in 5 major European capitals: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. This wasn't just a bank. It was the world's first information superhighway. They could move money and intelligence across borders faster than any government courier. And Nathan Rothschild, the genius in London, used this network to change the mechanics of borrowing forever. Before him, a government loan was a static agreement between a king and a banker. Rothschild changed the game by creating a secondary market. He didn't just lend money to the British government, he bought their bonds at a discount and then resold them to wealthy investors, pension funds, and insurance companies across Europe. He turned sovereign debt into a tradable asset, a product that could be bought and sold like corn or cotton. This is the moment the trap snaps shut on a global scale. The true power of this system was revealed in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. The fate of Europe hung in the balance between Napoleon and the British Army. Nathan Rothschild's private courier network brought him the news of Napoleon's defeat a full day before the British government knew. He used this information asymmetry to manipulate the bond market, selling heavily to trigger a panic, crashing the price, and then buying up the entire market for pennies on the dollar. When the official news arrived, prices soared, and Rothschild became the single most dominant creditor to the British Empire. But his real innovation wasn't the profit, it was the interconnectedness. By selling British debt to French investors and French debt to Austrian banks, he created a web so complex that no single country could default without crashing the entire system. Defaulting wasn't just refusing a creditor anymore. It was an act of economic suicide. If hearing this makes your blood boil, if you are realizing that the history you were taught in school conveniently left out the part where one family cornered the market on nations, then tap the like button right now. It's a small signal, but it tells the algorithm that we are tired of the sanitized version of history, and we are ready for the truth. Rothschild proved that whoever controls the debt controls the world, regardless of who sits on the throne. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschild family possessed the largest private fortune in human history, derived almost entirely from the interest paid by taxpayers of Europe. They didn't build factories, they didn't farm land, they farmed governments. But even this system had a limit. It relied on gold. There was only so much gold in the vaults, which meant there was a limit to how much debt could be issued. To make the trap truly infinite, the bankers needed to break the link between money and reality. And that required a new architect, an American titan who would engineer the greatest financial magic trick of the 20th century. By the turn of the 20th century, the United States was an industrial giant, but it still had a primitive financial system tied to the physical reality of gold. There was a hard limit on how much debt could exist, because there was only so much gold to back it. J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker in America, decided to break that limit. In 1907, a massive financial panic nearly destroyed the U.S. economy. Morgan personally stepped in, locking the country's top bankers in his private library and forcing them to bail out the system with their own money. He saved the economy, but he realized a terrifying truth. The system was too big for one man to save. The bankers needed a permanent mechanism, a lender of last resort that could print its way out of any crisis. But they had a problem. The American public hated central banks. They viewed them as tools of tyranny. So Morgan and his associates had to design a deception so brilliant that the people would welcome their own chains. In November 1910, 6 of the most powerful men in the world, representing the Rockefeller, Morgan, and Rothschild interests, boarded a private train car in New Jersey. They traveled under assumed names to a private hunting club on Jekyll Island, Georgia. For 9 days, in total secrecy, they wrote the legislation for the Federal Reserve. They deliberately avoided the name central bank, choosing Federal Reserve to make it sound like a government agency. It was neither. It was designed as a private corporation owned by its member banks, yet given the monopoly power to create the nation's currency. This was the birth of the infinite trap. Before the Fed, the government could only borrow money that actually existed. After the Fed, the government could issue a bond, and the Fed could simply create the money to buy it. This closed the loop. The government had an unlimited borrower, and the bankers had a guaranteed stream of interest payments from taxpayers. If you have ever looked at your paycheck, seen the taxes deducted, and felt a sinking feeling that you are working to pay off a debt that you never signed up for, you are feeling the ghost of Jekyll Island. You are sensing the invisible architecture that was designed to extract wealth from your labor before you even touch it. If you are tired of being told that inflation is transitory or necessary while your purchasing power vanishes, subscribe to the channel right now. Join us, because we are taking apart the engine of their wealth, bolt by bolt. The Federal Reserve Act passed in 1913, largely because Congress didn't understand it. Morgan died that same year, but his legacy was secure. He had built a machine that could create infinite debt. But there was one final problem. What happens when a country borrows too much and literally cannot pay the interest? The system needed a final architect to ensure that even bankruptcy wasn't an escape. By the 1970s, the global debt machine was running hot, but it was approaching a catastrophic limit. Developing nations across Latin America had borrowed billions of dollars to modernize, but they were struggling to keep up with the payments. The trap was about to break, until Paul Volcker made it inescapable. Volcker was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man tasked with saving the US dollar from hyperinflation. In 1979, he did the unthinkable. He raised interest rates to 20%, the highest in American history. While this saved the dollar, it crushed every country that had borrowed in dollars. Overnight, the interest payments for countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina tripled. In August 1982, Mexico called Wall Street and delivered the news that bankers fear most: we can't pay. This should have been the end. In a free market, Mexico would have defaulted. The American banks that lent the money would have gone bankrupt, and the system would have reset. But Volcker and the international banking establishment refused to let the debt die. Wait, guys, it takes a lot of time and research to make such highly informative videos for you. Don't you think I deserve and like and subscribe? Instead of allowing a default, they orchestrated a new kind of bailout using the International Monetary Fund, IMF. They lent these desperate countries more money, not to build roads or schools, but specifically to pay the interest back to the American banks. It was a money laundering operation disguised as aid. The money flowed from the IMF to Mexico and immediately back to Wall Street. But here was the catch: the innovation that turned debt into a weapon of war. These loans came with conditions. They were called structural adjustment programs. In exchange for the lifeline, countries were forced to sell off their state-owned assets, privatize their water and electricity, and open their markets to foreign corporations. They had to strip mine their own economies to service the debt. This was the final evolution of the trap. Debt was no longer just about financial profit. It was about political sovereignty. If a nation couldn't pay, it didn't get debt forgiveness. It got a new owner. This model has been rinsed and repeated for 40 years, from Argentina to Greece to Sri Lanka. The logic is brutal. When debt becomes unpayable, you don't eliminate it, you restructure it. You extend the timeline, you increase the principal, and you ensure the interest flows forever. If you are watching this and feeling a knot in your stomach, a realization that the aid we see on the news is actually a foreclosure process in disguise, then leave a comment below. Just write, "The system is rigged." Let's see how many of us are awake to this reality. Volcker died in 2019, but his legacy is a world where no nation is allowed to escape. They are only allowed to refinance. And this brings us to the terrifying present day. We have seen the history. We have seen the architects. Now we have to look at the $38 trillion elephant in the room. Who actually owns the United States? Now that we have exposed the architects, let's answer the question that started this video. Who exactly owns the $38 trillion that the United States owes? The media wants you to believe it's all owned by China, but that is a distraction. China owns less than 3% of US debt. The reality is far more uncomfortable. The debt is divided into two piles, and both of them reveal that the system is a closed loop designed to extract value from you. The first pile, about $12 trillion, is what we call intragovernmental debt. This is money the government owes to itself. Over decades, politicians raided the Social Security and Medicare trust funds, money that was supposed to be saved for your retirement, and spent it on wars and bailouts. In its place, they left an IOU. So a huge chunk of the, quote, national debt is actually evidence that the government looted its own piggy bank. They borrowed your future to pay for their present. The second pile, the remaining $26 trillion, is held by the, quote, public. But public doesn't mean you and me. It means the Federal Reserve, foreign central banks, and massive institutional asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, and pension funds. This is where the wealth transfer happens. Every year, the US government collects taxes from your paycheck. It then takes nearly $1 trillion of that tax money and pays it out as, quote, interest to these bondholders. Think about the mechanics of that. It is a direct pipeline taking money from the working class, who pay income tax, and funneling it to the asset holding class, who own the bonds. It is the largest wealth transfer in human history, happening right in front of our faces, disguised as fiscal policy. It is a shell game. Japan owes $9 trillion, mostly to the Bank of Japan. The US owes $38 trillion, largely to the Federal Reserve and US institutions. Everyone owes everyone, and the interest flows upward to the institutions that sit at the top of the pyramid. It is a circular firing squad of debt, where the weapon is compound interest, and the victim is the taxpayer. But the most terrifying part isn't who owns the debt. It's why the debt can never go away. If you think the solution is to simply pay it off and be done with it, you are missing the final, fatal design flaw of the system. The architects didn't just make debt permanent, they made it necessary. If we actually paid off the debt, the civilization as we know it would collapse. Let me explain the final paradox. Here is the final, fatal truth that the politicians will never admit on television. Even if the United States government wanted to pay off the $38 trillion debt, even if they taxed 100% of everyone's income and sold every asset, they physically cannot do it. Why? Because under the system JP Morgan and the Federal Reserve built, money creates debt, and debt creates money. They're the same thing. When the government issues a bond, the Federal Reserve prints the dollars to buy it. That dollar in your pocket is a unit of debt. It is a claim on the future labor of a taxpayer. If the government actually paid off the national debt to zero, they would have to redeem every bond. To redeem the bonds, they would have to take the dollars back out of circulation and destroy them. If you eliminated the debt, you would eliminate the money supply. The economy would grind to a halt. Trade would stop, and we would enter a deflationary depression that would make the 1930s look like a vacation. This is the perfect trap. The system requires debt to function. We are like a diver breathing through a hose. The debt is the air. If you cut the debt, you cut the air. This is why the quote national debt clock you see on the news is not a countdown to bankruptcy. It is a scorecard of control. The four architects didn't just build a bank. They built a prison with invisible bars. William Patterson made the debt permanent in 1694, so the interest would never stop. Nathan Rothschild made it global in 1815, so no country could escape the web. JP Morgan made it infinite in 1913 by linking it to the printing press. And Paul Volcker made it inescapable in 1982 by proving that even bankruptcy just leads to more borrowing. Together, they constructed a reality where solvency is illegal and perpetual debt is the only way to survive. The $38 trillion isn't a mistake. It isn't a result of, quote, bad policy, or, quote, wasteful spending, or, quote, one political party. It is a highly efficient business model, working exactly as it was designed 3 centuries ago. The interest payments are the rent we pay to live in their economy. Now that you see the bars of the cage, you have a choice. You can go back to watching the news and worrying about the, quote, debt ceiling theater. Or you can accept the brutal truth. The system isn't broken, it's fixed. If this video helped you see the Matrix for the first time, if you want to know not just how they built the trap, but how the, quote, smart money protects themselves from it, then click that subscribe button right now. We aren't just documenting the collapse. We are building the roadmap through it. Class dismissed.